3.7 Designing an experiment. The other kind of theory building a process was the use of actual experimentations in the laboratory. Such methods are often commonly used in the field of psychology and even culture, personality, socialization, and child rearing studies. Experiments and comparisons of what happens in the situations of the control group with what happens in the experimental group. Control in this context means holding one factor constant while others vary. However, the obvious drawback is not very many social situations can be reproduced under laboratory conditions. Sometimes the change that occurs in natural conditions are of far greater magnitude than those which can be produced artificially, or the emotional content is far more intense in real life than under experimental conditions. The element of play acting may also creep into such situations. In addition, it is possible to set up field laboratories where in real life situations one can examine the variables like in a classroom or factory. But more often theory in the social sciences is directed towards viewing the effects of a certain phenomena upon another or on society in general. Like a particular variable may be chosen, like dowry or building of a factory or introduction of television in an area, then the effects of the introductions of this variable upon the rest of the society are studied. Other kinds of studies may be directed towards the cause of a certain phenomena rather than its effects, like trying to ascertain the causes of female infanticide. The help of a hypothesis can set up such studies in two ways. Either there where a certain relationship between the phenomenon to be studied and some other variables deemed to be causative in is put forward, or otherwise it may be a purely exploratory study where the field is being approached for the first time. The latter are often in the nature of pilot studies done prior to the setting up of hypothesis, but they can also be fully length research of the exploratory descriptive type. For example, The Remembered Village by M. Srinivas. 3.8 How to test a hypothesis. For setting up hypothesis testing research, we must first have a theory, because the nature of the process relationship is ultimately derived from theory. A theory provides the basic logic of the relationship between different phenomena. The hypotheses are generated to test the truth of this relationship and therefore the correctness of the logic process, namely the theory, can be generated then. Every hypothesis contains a statement about the relationship between the at least two phenomena. One of them is phenomenon such as female infanticide that the researcher is trying to account for. The other is one that is thought to affect or bring about the phenomena that one is trying to account for. The first one is called the dependent variable and the second one is called independent variable. For example, if we put forward the hypothesis that illiteracy of mothers leads to female infanticide, then the female infanticide is the dependent variable and the literacy level of mothers is independent variable. To test the hypothesis, one has to expose it to a situation that can show it to be false. If the hypothesis survives the effort of fallacy, then it is proved true. In the above example, we can study the rate of female infanticide among a population of well-educated women. If the sample shows a significant rate of female infanticides that compares favorable with a corresponding sample of illiterate women, then the hypothesis is false. In other words, the literacy of a woman is not a significant variable as far as female infanticide is concerned. If on the other hand the sample of educated women shows a significant drop of incidence of female infanticide, then the hypothesis is tentatively proven. In the above example, one could rely on statistics to provide most of the base data, but not all social sciences variables are measured statistically. For that, one has to be measured by deductive process and set up some criteria oneself, or rely upon criteria provided by other studies. Let us now do the exercise of reflections and actions in 3.4 to work out the links between the variables and theories. After the exercise, we will discuss the common methods of testing the hypothesis. The reflections and actions 3.4. Take the example of the variable of status of women. There is a numerical measure for such a variable, but one can measure by relying on the theoretical statement made by others and the observations one makes in the field, or by eliciting the responses to a set of questions, or more realistically by combining a number of techniques. For example, what determines the status of women would depend on what theory we are subscribing to. What are you expected to do? Work on the match in the following exercise to find out who, the follower of which theory, would emphasize which variable to determine the status of women. Theory and emphasize on. First, Marxist feminist theory. In this, emphasis is given for sexuality, personal liberties, right of choice, freedom of expression, etc. In radical feminist theory, the symbolic and ritual expressions are highlighted. Interpretative theory, the economic variables such as income, inheritance of property, ownership patterns, etc. are given emphasis. 3.9. Common methods of testing hypothesis. Here we discuss the following 3 common methods of testing the hypothesis. First, pre-testing of the post-testing paradigm. One common method of testing a hypothesis is by pre-testing of the post-testing paradigm. You may ask, what is paradigm? For answer of the question, see box number 3.1. Box 3.1. What is a paradigm? The dictionary meaning of the paradigm is an example or pattern. In social sciences, we use the word as explained by Ritzer, who said that a paradigm is a fundamental image of the subject matter within a science. It serves to define what should be studied, what questions should be asked, how they should be asked, and what rules should be followed in interpreting the answers obtained. The paradigm is the broadest unit of consciousness within consensus. The paradigm is the broadest unit of consensus within a science and serves to differentiate one scientific community from another. It subsumes, defines, and interrelates the exemplars, theories, and methods and instruments that exist within it. To continue with our discussions of pre-testing, one simply studies the field prior to the introduction of a variable and after its introduction. Let us say the study of a village after building of a road, or after an event like an election or epidemic. However, the dangers of such a paradigm is that one is not sure about the variable under considerations being reasonable for the transformations, and there is always the problem of extraneous factors. For examples of this kind of before and after studies, see box 3.2. Box 3.2. Examples of before and after studies as given in Srivastava. Two so-called before and after studies are regarded as an alternative to the classical experimental design. In them, a phenomena is studied before and after the introduction of independent variable. A comparison of the two states will tell us about the change. F. Stuart Chapin's study 1963 of public housing in Minneapolis coined the term ex post facto research for such studies in the Indian market. Many researchers working on communities that have been displaced because of development projects, such as the construction of the industries, have adopted this approach. See the Eastern anthropologist. 2. Static group comparison paradigm. In the static group comparison paradigm, instead of studying the same field studies situation before and after, one compares two similar field situations, one with and the other without the introductions of the independent variable. For example, one may have two identical neighboring villages, but one gets access to the television and the other does not. So one may study the effects of television viewing by comparing the villages. Does this example remind you of the Scarlett Epstein's work cited earlier? Third, non-equivalent control group paradigm. In the non-equivalent control group paradigm, one compares one field situations before and after the introduction of an independent variable, but also compares it with a field in which the variable has not been introduced but which is similar in all other aspects. This would be the case, say, of for example, when one have had two identical villages that were both studied and then one of them received a significant input like a school, then both schools again studied to see what effect the school had, but now we can compare it by measuring against the village that did not receive the school. The most common source of error here would be that some sort of a selection process has already taken place for the introductions of the external variable. For example, a particular population size or caste comparison may be responsible for the fact that one village receives a school and the other did not. To compare the possibility of such an error, fourth paradigm may be taken recourse to, and in this is called the non-equivalent control group paradigm. Here everything is like the third paradigm situations, except that the field situations are chosen at random and not selectively. However, this also depends upon the possibility of having such random selection, that is, if there are enough field situations of the similar type of, and whether the researchers has access to selection of any such field situations. One can have such a paradigm when the number of situations is many and equal available. Say, if one were to study the effects of introductions of computers in secondary school in Delhi, the most obvious disadvantage of random sampling is that one may not get the desired result. In fact, such methods are more useful for quantitative research, like the school example cited. 3.10 Sensitivity to alternative explanations. One fact that must be kept in mind while doing research and using various paradigms discussed is that as social scientists, one must be sensitive to the existence of alternative explanations even if one has proven the hypothesis. Rigidity is not a virtue, because social science research of real life situation is complex and multifaceted. 3.11 Rival hypothesis construction. The process of rival hypothesis construction is a standard procedure to test the efficacy of research. The four factors that form the basis of the four major rival hypotheses are the effects of selection, the reactive measurement effects, the effect of uncontrolled extraneous variables, interaction effects involving selection. Let us each of the four factors. First, the effects of selection. A selection effect occurs whenever the treatment group or the group we are studying for the introductions of variable is different from the comparison group because of the way in which they are selected or rejected for introductions of particular variable, like for example school. The advantage of that may be emanating from the school, may be because the number of persons of the dominant caste or class is more in the particular village, and the school may have been introduced because of greater color and dominant caste members. So it is the class advantage that may have already been there, and not merely the introduction of the school may be the perceived in the study or better hygiene consciousness or better use of medical facilities. 2. The reactive measurement effects. The second rival hypothesis situations may occur when the measurement process itself may introduce transformations in the field, like for example as it would happen when students from Delhi go to carry out field-based research in villages. The reception of the villages of the urban elite middle caste to which the students may belong often affects the responses and sometimes even the behavior pattern. The villages might, for example, wear more urban clothes while researchers were around or profess greater faith in both in modern medicine. 3. The effects of uncontrolled extraneous variables. The third type of error is due to the introduction of uncontrolled extraneous variables, that is, those variables that are overlooked or that ended while the research was in progress. Interaction effects involving selection. The fourth type of error occurs when the selection processor and extraneous variables both occur in conjunction. Our discussion of hypothesis testing is a process that takes the researchers a step forward in the investigation. It is an example of the organized skepticism of science. In other words, we may say that This affects the rejection of any statement without empirical verification. A number of workers have been based on process of hypothesis testing, and several middle range theories have emerged as a result of such intuitive analysis. One good example in the work of Robert K. Merton on the American soldier, in which he had developed the theory of latent and manifest functions. The effort to produce a rigorous theoretical analysis in the social sciences is how always met with skepticism, as the result rarely are able to attain the status of laws, but different middle range theories like that of Matron cited above can be quite effective in explaining, if not predicting, social behavior. 3.12 The use and scope of social science theory. A very significant aspect of social science research is that this research itself is often instrumental in changing human behavior. If human beings are made aware of destructive or potentially disruptive behavior, then they can and do make conscious efforts to change it. Refer to the rationale and purpose of MSO 002 as discussed in the course introduction. Okay, in this way, the subjects and objects of study in the social sciences have a dynamic, interactive relationship. For example, if certain kinds of child rearing practices are shown to be harmful for the normal development of the child, then they may be arguably modified and abandoned. Any predictions made by the study on its ill effects of a particular practice may be reversed during the course of its research itself. Okay, so moreover, a lot of research in sociology and anthropology has been directed towards revealing what has been variously called latent functions of unintended consequences of human actions. However, once made public, these do not remain latent or unintended, and may in fact replace the earlier way of thinking by the actors themselves. For example, in urban India, marriage is by and large not considered a religious or sacred ceremony, to extent that it can be believed to be a generation back. More people would point out it as an occasion to bring the family together, or to cement social relationship, or to increase social solidarity, a function of marriage that in earlier times was perhaps more visible to the social analyst than to the actors themselves. Many scholars now consider it possible that subjective dimensions of human behavior, like modes, dispositions, emotions, and values, are open to sensory perceptions and therefore form part of external observable data. The conclusions that we reach regarding such objects are based either on the information given to us by the actors or by the process of empathetic understanding where the scholar tries to get into place of the actor. Rosaldo, in his article The Rage of the Headhunter, puts himself in the place of the headhunter to analyze the anguish that is felt at the death of a loved one, at loss of his wife, Michaelo Rosaldo. Thus, the social scientist interprets the actions in terms of the subjective experience as human being and being subject to the same emotions and motivations as any other. On the other hand, it is also realized that one need not step mentally into the shoes of actors to understand a phenomena. For example, one need not be suicidal at any point of time to do a sociological analysis of suicide, but there is certainly a qualitative difference between the kind of analysis that looks at the phenomenon from the outside and more reflexive kind of descriptive work. Not all types of human behavior are subjective, and there are many concrete and visible outcomes of behavior that can be measured and studied. An alternative method of constructing theory came from the behaviorists, who rejected the vagueness implied in the subject understanding. An extreme behaviorist position may deny all subjective and internal mental conditions, but most preferred a modification version. Here, introspective data from subject is treated as data and then subjected to analysis. This is similar to the approach where contradictory inputs by various actors in the field are analyzed as data that represent the conditions of the field, like different power positions occupied by the actors or conflicting identities. At this point in our discussion, we need to look at the questions: how do values held by researchers affects theory building? So in 3.13 section we are discussing theory building and researchers' values. The last point on which we will concentrate in this unit would be the extent to which the values held by a social scientist enter into the process of theory formations, or in other words, what is known as the value-oriented bias of social science inquiry. The 4 point at which values can enter: the level of selection of problems, the determinations of contents and conclusion, the identifications of facts, and for the assessment of evidence. We shall now discuss each of the entity for values of researchers to creep into the social science. Selection of problems. A social scientist is guided by several considerations in the choice of subject matter, of which his value orientation is one. That is, a feminist would be interested to research women's problems, or Marxist to work on subject like agrarian relations or exploitation of labor in factories. Moreover, the manner in which a concept is constructed, such as say the concept of culture or what goes into determining the status of women, is also conditioned by the subjective orientation of the researchers. The determination of the contents of conclusions. The determinations of contents of conclusion is something on which criticism of almost all theories is based. It is felt that most social scientists have a fairly well-formed idea of what is the nature of the reality that they are trying to prove, and most research is aimed at proving or disapproving what is already intuitively known to the scholars. Moreover, the large interest about the society at large, or moral or ethical viewpoints, often creep into one's whatever a theory is trying to prove or disapprove. During the colonial regime, most anthropologists took equilibrium as the natural state of societies, and their theories are directed towards demonstrating how much equilibrium states are maintained. Any disruption of the equilibrium was seen as abnormal or pathological, or a condition of anomaly. The value orientations of the sociologists and anthropologists colluded with that of administrators, and often both were one and the same person. Or otherwise, the anthropologist was on the payroll of the administrator. The goal of administrators was to establish equilibrium in their colonies. Therefore, equilibrium was also the desired state and viewed as by the scholars. Now, third, the identification of facts. It is not impossible to distinguish between facts and values, and contributions to theoretical understanding may be achieved even if the values of the social scientists are at a variance. For example, the contribution made by ideologically oriented social scientists such as Marx is still considered of considerable theoretical significance, especially if they had been able to contain their value orientation within the limits of reason. Another remedy often resorted to in contemporary theory is to make the value of orientations of any work quite clear, so that the reader is not misled and is able to contextualize the theories to its orientation. This could also take care, for example, of the difficulties faced in the social sciences because of the evaluative character of the terms and concept used. It is not always very clear as to what exactly is the distinctions between the facts and values. For example, in the 19th century, a certain kind of ecological approach concentrated quite a bit on the study of resource utilization as a way of looking at communities' relationship with habitat. Often looking towards the global goal of maximizing such utilization. But another school of environmentalists would vehemently be opposed to the term resource being used for the habitat, as this term in itself is reflective of an exploitative attitude towards environment. Such persons may not think of the environment as a resource for use by humans communities, but as something that has a right to extend by itself, something that has a right to existence by itself. The second point of view may look upon maximization of resource utilization as a negative rather than a positive goal. Moreover, while writing ethnography, one may be tempted to use words like kind or cruel, both of which cannot be understood without reference to a value framework. Contemporary ethnographies normally tend to consciously avoid using such terms, preferring instead to give a detailed descriptions of the actions, leaving it to the readers to form their own judgment, or using such term by which the actors themselves designate the acts. The fourth, the assessment of evidence. There is always the apprehensions that only conclusions, but even what process of evaluation of data is often value loaded. Some kind of data may be totally overlooked or ignored by social scientists simply because of innate value orientation. For example, the feminist scholars had alleged that the male scholars ignored women's activities and role in society simply because of their patriarchal bias. Does these discussions remind you of the examples of Venus study of Trobriand Islanders mentioned earlier in the unit 2? Similarly, Dalit scholars have often made allegations that upper caste scholars have often presented a biased Brahminical view of society in India, selectively using data to do so. Even in a statistical analysis, value commitments are not ruled out. But value commitments are also of two kinds, covert and overt. For example, Malinowski oversight may have been unintentional, but sometimes researchers allegedly manipulate data towards a particular end. One kind of bias that is almost inevitable is the one connected with the historical and situational impact upon a student of society of the place and time to which he belongs. As we shall discuss in greater detail in the next unit, the evolution of scientific thought is also a product of the history of human society. World events and transformations of intellectual climate are determining the factors that can be rarely be avoided in the manner in which theory is formed. 3.14 Conclusion. Human history and human knowledge are inextricably interlinked. This is how we come to have a sociology of knowledge, and that is why the history of a discipline is always an integral part of its curriculum. However, if we accept the subjective nature of sociological knowledge is that only the followers of the school of thought that produced it can understand a theory, the problem has been particularly solved by the concept of relational objectivity or rationalism. In this, the social scientists make it clear at the outset the perspective that is being followed in the analysis so that the readers can subsequently put in the context their findings and draws their own conclusions. The point is to make clear the basic assumptions on which the theory is formulated, and it is for other scholars to accept or reject the theory on the basis of whether the basic premises are acceptable or not. For example, the entire debate on whether matriarchy or patriarchy was the initial stage of human society is meaningful only when one accepts the basic premise of the stage by stage evolution of human societies. If one does not accept the basic premise itself, then the entire debate becoming meaningless. If we do not accept the above path, the only generalizations that can have universal validity in social sciences are the statistical generalization. Like, say for example, the fact that the female infanticide rates have increased from 1950 to 2004, but such generalizations are not theory. They only form the basis for the theory, and when the theory is formulated out of statistical generalizations, there is still plenty of scope for varied interpretations. In Unit 4, we shall look into a broad overview of the way in which theoretical analysis have been proceeded in sociology and how the major premises have transformed themselves historically. Further reading is given by Kaplan Abraham 1960 for the conduct of inquiry. This is the only paper. Okay. So this is the end of the unit 3.